It'd be really good if you guys could have your microphones off while we're doing the presentations. And similarly, from a video point of view, it'll be really good when we start having a discussion. You may want to put your video on so that we can see you and share the discussions. It's always nice to see a smiling face rather than a couple of letters. So today, really pleased that I'm being joined by the NIA, DECOM Mission and PA Consulting, really to start talking more about cross-industry interrelations and collaboration and how we can work together. And from a personal point of view, it's just really good to be here because I've been talking for many years about how in different industries, there are many shared challenges and many shared problems that if we start talking and discussing and working on things together, we can probably do things better and more efficiently as well. And really, it comes down from having this shared belief that the commercial and other priorities and technical opportunities are unexplored between us when we look at nuclear, when we look at oil and gas, so many things we can do together. And we really just want to extend this dialogue and push for change. Now, I know some of you will have joined us in in-person event we had in January up in Glasgow. And that was a great workshop where we started actually exploring what some of those opportunities may look like to work more together. And at that workshop, we had some great discussions. We had some discussions on what we wanted to do going forward, what was important for us, and how we could maybe stop just talking and do some doing as well. And many of you offered discussion points and thoughts on what we could do going forward, what those activities could look like, and how they could benefit us in our day-to-day job and broader. So a great picture there from the workshop in January. And really, this webinar was designed to continue that conversation. We didn't want it to be too long after the event that we'd lost any momentum. And what we're going to take you through in this next hour is some thoughts building on the feedback we've had from that workshop, and also thinking about what those next steps can be. What can we do? What can we work together? And so we're really keen as well in this webinar that we hear what you think and what you want as well, because you know you're the experts in this call. So really keen to have you here. I'm now going to pass on to Sam, who can introduce himself and talk about a few of our next steps. Sam.
Thanks, Heather. So my name's Sam Long. I'm the Chief Exec at DECOM Mission. Be familiar to some and maybe not familiar to others. As Heather's underlining, this is a continuation of a conversation we've been working on for a while. But the key takeaways are that we still firmly believe that there is this transferability between nuclear DECOM and oil and gas DECOM, and by extension, renewables as well. And I think if you're a real spod for this, like I am, then you probably understand, you probably get a greater exposure to that. And I think we're just trying to encourage that broader awareness across the whole community. That said, you're going to hear a wee debate between James and I representing the two sides of the coin. And I often find that people are a little bit reluctant, and I think we'd like to tease out some of that reluctance. Why is it there? Because I think the case we're going to put today is there's a lot of commonality that people may not perceive. But I think if you spend time working in it, you go, there is commonality, which is a word Heather's already used. So I'm going to quickly rattle us through some slides to talk about set context and scale, and then James and I will have a wee head-on-head kind of discussion to reflect the conversations from Glasgow. Okay, so moving on. So scale. So I think one of the boundaries we often interpret in the DECOM play, if a nuclear and oil and gas is a fundamental difference. Okay, so one's onshore, one's offshore. And I think that has a real binding impact on people's perception and people's willingness to dive into the other sides of it. But underneath that this is all about energy. It's all about the net output of energy and the fact that we are going through a decarbonisation process for energy production in general at the moment. We are also going through an age of asset and maturation process, which means our installed civilian nuclear base and our installed offshore oil and gas base are both typically early developed 50s, 60s, 70s, and many assets are now 40, 50 years old and approaching the end of their operational life. So whether you think that's a policy decision that's ended up where we are, or whether it's just the age of the assets, either things that are all coming together. So this is Hunterston B. There's an A to it as well. But the point being, they've just come offline. They're currently being defueled, but these are going to be large scopes for the future. So both onshore and offshore, you've got this energy infrastructure that is coming to its end of use, and the supply chain have known for a while that there's a scope of work coming around the corner. So the next slide, not surprisingly, is going to show you a picture of an offshore asset. Actually, this is cheating. This is BP Clare. She's one of the youngest assets in the North Sea. It's just a dramatic photo, okay? Clare sits right out on the west of Shetland. So you're talking in an extreme environment on the very edge of the Atlantic Ridge. There's possibly, I can't remember how many more developments are going to go on around there. So don't take the general good condition of this photo to be reflective of what DECOM looks like. But it's more about the location, the depth of water, and the physical hard challenge of installing and removing these. Remember that when you're building a power station or installing a plant like this, it's all about first oil, first energy, first kilos, watts. So the drive is very much on, let's get out there, let's make it work. And there's a lot of money to be spent in order to get to that production. But when it comes to decommissioning, the opposite applies. It's a cost item to the owner. They may not be a schedule driver anymore. So these are flips of construction. So decommissioning is not the opposite of construction. And we'll get to that in the next slide, actually. But it is important to remind that those two key drivers in terms of cost and bottom line and schedule are a commonality in nuclear and in oil and gas decom. By the way, any one of my fellow colleagues is welcome to jump in and correct Sam at any point in time. So I'm going to keep moving on seamlessly to my next slide. The point being here that Heather and the NDA team, they're very conscious of it, they're very aware of it, but actually in order to deconstruct their infrastructure, they're also currently doing a lot of construction activity. Got to bear in mind that Sellafield in particular, it's 15,000 people. This is not simple. This is not maybe what human perception, basic common perception is of these projects. It's mega projects divided into multiple different scopes, and so there is a lot of preparatory work. If I continuously follow that on, the next two slides will help build on that theme of you have to construct to destruct. We have to build teams. We have to build the infrastructure, we have to build the project capability, but we are still pouring a lot of concrete. Talking of building things, this is a grainy photo, so it hasn't come up very well, but this is Pioneering Spirit. This is a $3 billion build by a private owned company who've said, we're going to do decommissioning in oil and gas differently. She's one of the world's largest vessels. This is a 38,000 ton structure that she's lifted off here. So this is built specifically to do oil and gas decommissioning and is a game changer in that community. She's not built just for decommissioning, it's worth adding. She's perfectly good for doing install of pipes and installs of topsides as well. So a complicated asset with multiple uses, but the point being a family-owned company spotted an opportunity that justified raising €3 billion worth of debt to finance that. Now, the tenuous link is, if I go to the next slide, the same vessel dropped off this topsides, which might or might not be the same one as the one in the shot before it, to Able in Teesside for breaking down and recycling. The interesting thing was the site on which she's about to be offloaded in this photo was the largest piling job done in Europe at that period, which is about 2015, 2016. So again, the scale of some of these projects is considerable. You know, slightly cheesy title, but I've gone with Move the Immovable on this picture. So here is a 38,000 ton structure that's been bought in by a $3 billion €3 billion vessel into a yard in Europe, into a yard in the UK that had spent 25 million GBP just building the quayside to receive the topsides. So these are really good engineering projects to get your head into. This is a construction job for a PWR. I suspect it's actually not in Europe. I'm less concerned about the content of the photo, but more about what the location of the photo, but more about, let's think about this, a nuclear reactor and the reactor vessel and the boilers that are associated with it. Again, very, very high-end engineering designed to meet certain tolerances, designed to give you complete containment. Deconstructing something that was designed to guarantee you containment in the first place isn't straightforward. You can't just go at this with an angle grinder and quite happily remove it when it's taking you 10 years to build it in the first place. There's a lot of steel, a lot of concrete, and clearly there are hazardous materials involved as well. So it was more to do with the scale. In fact, I should have had a picture of Sizewell C. That's probably what I should have had here. It's also worth remembering when we talk about things like Sizewell C, the new builds, there is a greater awareness of the need to decom in the new builds. The original generation at Dounreay, the original generation at Sellafield, these weren't particularly built in a way which it designed for decom is the language we use. So we have to destruct the indestructible, cheesy. I'm more than happy to be told off at the end of this presentation about my choice of words. And then actually the decommission team have literally just come out of another webinar where we were talking about how do we do dismantling and how do we do handling of materials on shore. It's really worth remembering at the end of the day, a lot of this is about isn't about hazardous materials. Once you've removed the hazardous materials, you are doing deconstruction and demolition work. There are specialist contractors for those environments. But because you're working in what we call process, so process safety and chemical and high hazardous environments means that there are certain controls that have to be there. But ultimately, you're talking about gas axing, mechanical jaws and shears to cut up large volumes of steel, to remove concrete and aggregate, and then to extract the high value items out of it. So this is an NDA picture from an NDA site, but actually that could be a demolition site in a coal plant or somewhere else like that. So the point is, there is a lot of manual labor, there's a lot of processing and moving of equipment, materials, but at the end of the day, there's actually a considerable amount of recycling and reuse opportunities within this. The volumes of steel that you're talking about between the two sectors, Heather might jump in here quicker than I am. There's about 1 million tons of oil and gas infrastructure in the North Sea due to come on shore, and there's more than an equivalent amount of that within the NDA estate. So there's at least 2 million tons of steel just to come out of these two sectors alone, for all of which can be readily recycled and reused inside the UK and Europe. So we had this webinar, not a webinar, this is a webinar. We had our meeting in Glasgow in January. And we wanted to summarize to the audience for those who hadn't been there, what did that mean? What were the shared characteristics we were starting to identify between decom in nuclear and decom in oil and gas? Hard factors, engineering, it's all about the engineering. And I think when we had that event in January in Glasgow, we were really keen on, man, we can talk about peer-to-peer kind of engineering. We can talk about the mechanical and the electrical and the instrument. And they're both looking in same discipline, looking in different sectors. But actually, when we held the workshop in Glasgow, it was quite clear everybody's happy with that. Everybody's happy that they're working in an engineering discipline and that they know what they're doing, and they fully accept that they may be in one sector, they may be in both. So actually, people don't get too worried about the hard factors and the hard engineering. What's really causing the greatest delays or the greatest amount of inefficiencies are the soft factors. So we do know that the shared characteristics of the engineering disciplines and project management are shared, but we also know that access to capital is proven to be a problem in both of these communities. And I probably hadn't anticipated that in the oil and gas world. Capital is not flowing very well. It does not like to be associated with greenfield, brownfield, or late life oil and gas assets. But even in nuclear projects, they're struggling to access capital in a way that makes sense. Attracting and retaining people, I don't know why I've put it at the middle bullet. It should just be the biggest bullet on the page, and everyone else should just bow down before it and acknowledge it as the biggest issue there is. There are opportunities to improve our shared learnings. James and I are going to discuss some of that in a moment. And then ultimately, this is about long timescales. In oil and gas, it takes about 7 years. We were just asked that in the previous webinar. What is the typical timescale to plan and remove an asset? 7 years. But remember that for the ultra hazardous sites on a nuclear location, it can be multi-generational. So how are you going to do these projects when they're lasting for a very long time? And then underneath this all is the concept of a just transition. What do we do about employment? What do we do about wealth generation? What do you do about the fact that you may be removing energy infrastructure that has been there for decades and those jobs may no longer exist? So I do feel, to summarize briefly, the workshop we had in Glasgow, these are shared characteristics, but some of them are real challenges in nuclear and in oil and gas decom. Assuming everybody's happy, by the way, the picture on the left, if you don't know what that is, that's Spot by Boston Dynamics. Very, very cool quadruped. We see Spot and others who ilk it. They are being used in oil and gas, but from my perspective, you're getting much better use out of them in the nuclear community right now. So it's another good example of there's money being spent on technology. That technology is applicable in both fields, but one sector may be making more out of it than the other, and that should be leading to questions. Why does it work better suited in one area than not in the other? So moving on. Now, there's a lovely shot photo of me on the left there, James, and a shockingly blurry photo of James on the right. So what we're going to do here is just have a wee chat between James and I, because actually it shouldn't just be death by slides isn't really our intent here. So James, do you want to introduce yourself and kick the ball off on this bit whilst you and I have this chat?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking of that photo. That probably is a bit more actually what I look like nowadays, the blurry hair and after children, all that stuff. Way more greys than when it was originally taken. So, that's it. And so, for everyone on the course, I'm James Hanson. I'm a consultant for PA Consulting. I specialise in the nuclear sector and integrating major programs together. So, designing them, bringing people together from different capabilities, different parts of life, be it engineers or op model specialists or change people, to really deliver real world change in projects. I started my career actually, and Sam actually showed it on Brent Bravo. First years of my life, I was on the Brents doing decommissioning work, and having decided that I didn't want to spend most of my life in the middle of the North Sea, I came onshore and consulting to work on a project management side of things, and have moved over to nuclear in the latter years of my career, working at the NDA, and more recently up in Dounreay, transforming how they run their sites. And I think the fascinating thing from looking at both sectors is that the more you talk to people about this, the more you talk around the cross-serve challenges, the more they just start coming out of the woodwork, left, right, and centre. And it's the great thing about this conversation is actually really starting to actually open up some of those discussions of that piece, because I think, Sam, when we first started talking about this, we were actually wondering, are there actually anything? And that was the first hypothesis, was, is there actually opportunities for this? And I think, just having this conversation, what we want to get out of people is to think, yes, there are some, and the more you talk about this, the more you meet and network with people across industries and stuff, you start to realize this huge thing that we really have, not just for individual basis, but for the country as a whole. There are some big things we can gain about here. And so that's why I'm really excited about this opportunity and what we're going to be talking about today. And I do need to go get a better photo, Sam. I'll go back to the bods at work and make sure that happens.
Next time I see you, we all know that I'm a real bore when it comes to photographs. I'm well known around the world for being very boring about my photographs. I'll help you out. How about that as an offer?
That's beautiful.
I'm going to concur with your words. I think the more time you spend looking cross industry, the more you realize there are opportunities there. We are keen to understand both opportunity and barriers. So if people perceive there to be barriers, we're more than happy to address that between us. It's our jobs and our responsibility to underline this message and share it with people. You and I. So when we were in Glasgow, we're going to show some sample scopes in a moment from oil and gas and nuclear, just to reinforce to each of the respective audiences what we're talking about. But we tried to do that in Glasgow, and then I imagined we would have this big chat about engineering. And actually, most people were very dismissive of engineering as not a problem. It's absolutely there. The soft factors are the real challenge. You and your team had proposed a lovely idea around, I've called it a design review board, but I think you just talk more about design assurance. Do you want to quickly talk us through what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, Spot the Dog is a great example. He's walking around up in Dounreay at the moment, characterizing different sites, mapping places that you can't get people into, and really seeing some cool stuff. And so what we mean by a design assurance board, design review, or whatever you want to call it, is looking at how you get experts from different industries to review a major project plan, engineering plan, design plan, whatever you want to be. So if it is something around building a giant building or innovating new technologies, making sure you've got the people who are experts in their field from cross sectors who can come together and actually give their insights to this. I mean, firstly, who doesn't want to be called an expert in their field? I think is one thing to be said. Who doesn't want to be shown and actually get their paws onto something that really excites them? So if it's someone who, from an oil and gas side, designs big mega structures of steel, to be able to show, and structure engineer from that side, to be able to look at one of the decommissioning plans from the NDA side to say, this is how we're looking at decommissioning this plan. What are your thoughts on our things? What outside-in thinking can you bring to this problem to help us design? It would be a fascinating position to be in, and one that you'd assume people want to really be part of. So I definitely would like to be that.
So I might go a bit I might go a bit off script here, and then people will go, what the hell's Sam up to? So I don't know how many people, I posted a piece on, we're holding a safety event on Thursday. I posted a piece on LinkedIn about 3 weeks ago, encouraging people to watch a BBC Two documentary, remember, 3-parter about the NASA Columbia thing. So that's really interesting. NASA had Challenger go horribly wrong in 1986, something like that. And the word groupthink had been invented in the 70s, but it got reapplied to NASA in terms of, here's a singular culture with a singular team who are only focused on the one mission, but actually very siloed in their approach. And the amazing thing about Columbia was the Challenger, the shuttle teams hadn't really learnt from Challenger, which had been in 86, and this happened in 2003. So 17 years later, they send up a shuttle on its way up. It has a contact between an insulation foam coming off the main tank and it hits the shuttle. But there was numerous reasons why NASA chose not to use external support to help them have a look at the engineering of what they'd done, and then they had a catastrophic outcome of that. Now, I don't mean to be glib, and maybe it's a bit conceited to draw that analogy, but to me, there's something there about the groupthink. And that's why I love the design review board, the idea that we could bring peers from either industry sector against each other and say, this is what we're doing, could be a beautiful opportunity for, even if you only identified one major safety or one major engineering thing, it might actually be A, about efficiency, or B, improved performance or protection of persons and protections in the environment. And go on, James.
I do think, Sam, from that thing, I think a review board would be the right word, because what we're not trying to do here is add extra layers of bureaucracy and issues to this piece. What we're not trying to say is these people have a say to say no. They're trying to bring in outside-in thinking. You want to have this early on in the process to really help and support people's actually efforts in designing big pieces of work, to really kind of help push the boat out with innovative ideas.
I'm going to absolutely agree. I've just been traveling for the last 2 weeks with a bit of UK government support, but meeting people in Indonesia and in Malaysia, and that was Australia the week before. And we've just had our own webinar. But you can sense that there are people who lesser experience around the world who are clearly looking for guidance or support. And I think it's another good example. If we can use these review boards to start even if it's just saying, that's great, well done, then we're on to something, and that's really cool. The other one that does bubble up and is important, and you've got experience with both of these, James, is that waste characterization piece. We do have some levels of radioactive waste in oil and gas, but not that much. But we do have plenty of nasties, and they can be in considerable volume. Or maybe I should shut up. You're the one with more experience here. Do you want to talk to us about waste characterization?
No, it was a funny one that was reflected in the session, because from my time when I was working on the Brents, we had NASA come out to look at the silos and pods to characterize what was in the place. And it was all very exciting, all a fantastic thing, getting the little bore to go down the pipes and actually characterize what was in the legs of the platform. But one of the things that really came out from Glasgow is that we have characterization experts all over the UK within the nuclear sector. We have to characterize all of the chemicals that we have within nuclear waste to an nth degree to make sure we know what waste route they need to go down, which methodology we use, and how we look at that. So these are the expertise that are really, really abundant within the nuclear sector, that you don't need to be going to NASA, however cool that might be and however great that could look. The NASA coveralls were particularly cool, it has to be said. I didn't quite manage to have one of those, unfortunately. But using actually look a bit closer to home to think about, well, look, we have people and teams who would love to come and support, to help out in these areas, and supply chains as well. And we'll get on supply chains in a bit, Sam, but really if you can cross-fertilize these supply chains across industries, it just really helps to expand what you can look at, how you can look at these problems. And now we know this isn't something that is prevalent as much in the nuclear sector and the oil and gas sector as the nuclear sector, but it's definitely something to be looked at and considered. And actually, from a discussion, Sam, you won't know this, I had with a colleague, we were talking around the norm problem and characterization of norm within offshore platforms. I remember my days as an RPS offshore. You get some casing would come up from the sea. You'd get your little guy counter it. You see norm alpha. God's sake. And then you have to get into my RPS container and start getting all the materials and stuff out. Now, this is actually a very effective way of doing characterization, which is you have all your equipment there, they come mobilized in, it's dropped in, specialist equipment that comes in and then comes out when you're finished. This is not something that happens in the nuclear sector. It is not something that we think about how do you bring different capabilities and move them around the country so you can use the specialist skill set when you need them, how you need them. And so actually, the kind of one of the great things from a platform is that you have to have that logistics and moving things around and have to be able to plug and plug out things. And these are the lessons that the nuclear team could even think, nuclear sector could look about how do you characterize, how do you learn and move things around and deal with things on the fly as and when the challenges come.
There are numerous permutations of that conversation that I think you can run with. So for those who aren't familiar with the offshore environment, bed space is the #1 criteria that drives all projects. I only have limited number of accommodation in an offshore environment in which I can put people. It drives your schedule whether you like it or not. I do wonder whether you and I are in the weeds a bit here. Is it worth us explaining a bit more what waste characterization means? I mean, in the webinar we've just been having, the consequences of getting your waste characterization wrong when you're estimating or tendering for services is phenomenal. It's just where escalation comes from, right? In the webinar we've just been running, there's a really good example of another asset that had to be brought on shore. So in oil and gas, much the cost reduction for decommissioning is based on the notion that we can move the hazardous and the contaminated materials onshore and then treat them there, which makes sense. Are these two? There's a consequences piece there and getting the estimate and the cost wrong, and then there's also the fact that we can move waste around. Is that relevant in does that feel like a fit for I suppose it does for the NDA and NWS and others as well, right?
Yeah, I completely think it is. I mean, it's one of the biggest issues, and it's waste routes, we call it in the nuclear sector, is when you start decommissioning stuff, you get this product and you don't know what it is, and then you have to move it somewhere to store it safely, but then you might not have storage to it. And then your whole waste routes and pipeline gets really, really blocked up because you don't have capacity to move things on. So you're actually limited in how much you can do actually productive work because you don't have the routes to move things forwards if you haven't really thought and planned it through and don't have the information. And I'll talk about it when I kind of go through my sample scope in a section. But one of the problems, one of the great similarities in the industries, I remember on the Brents, is that you're looking through folders that are from the 60s around these things designed, where they aren't thought around actually how they've done this, what their things, decommissioning wasn't thought about when dealing with it, which is exactly the same in the nuclear sector. So what is a point that in design, you're happy with the amount of knowledge you have, so that you can actually say, yes, we can go ahead knowing some of the issues and challenges you might have if you do come across a problem that you're not too sure about, risk and there is an abandonment plug that you weren't expecting in the well, or you open up a cupboard within a facility and there is a glove box that wasn't on the manifesto or something along those lines. These are all challenges that you have to deal with in a risk appetite across both sectors. And that has knock-on effects down the line.
I suspect this is where the spods in us come out, right? Because it just feels exactly the same. And I think that's why those of us who are working in this cross-sector drive get excited, because we recognize it's just like, oh my God, I've got an analog to that story for sure. I do remember one of the first pieces of work I ever looked at in the early 2000s. We only made a major step forward when an individual from BP went, oh, I've got all the microfiche in my garage. Right, so he had kept all of the original drawings, a copy of the copies in his garage, and quite happily came in and went, there you go. And it was only then that everybody went, oh, now we've got a complete drawing of the whole installation. Now, that was 20 years ago. Things have changed quite a bit. So just quickly humor me here. Does the same happen in the civilian nuclear? Or you're not allowed to talk about that. Is that probably just a national risk if we talk about how old the data is and how weak it is?
There are some wonderful rooms which, for those who don't know, I'm a mechanical engineer by trade, and I get absolutely incredible by these beautifully hand-drawn drawings that are a very beautiful thing to look at, but how accurate they can be and how great they can be is a different story altogether. So there are, fortunately, kind of modern practices and modern plants that's obviously different, but some of those other ones you'd be shocked, as I said in the chat.
I think some of the other stuff you and I were going to touch on was about that end of state. And I find that really fascinating because in nuclear, that's multi-generational and might be a century away from now or 2 centuries away from where we are now. I remember a fascinating conversation with the geological deposit team about, well, how are we going to mark these sites so that in 200 years' time, somebody from the Orion belt who have arrived on an alien spaceship can actually open the damn thing. And in oil and gas, the interesting thing for those of you who think oil and gas is easy, you just rip it out and take it away, we have we don't have a real definition around it, the legal term of perpetual liability. So those who have drilled a hole into the earth to extract hydrocarbons are meant to guarantee that when they hand it back to the government, that has been resolved. Are those two incompatible, or centuries and decades, or it's interesting, different drivers there, right? Taxation, fiscal, all that lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's centuries and what's even millennia, some places within the nuclear industry, if you consider the deep geological facility that they're planning to be building. But it's really kind of considering actually, well, what are you happy with leading this site? What kind of position with it? And if you think around most factories, most facilities, most power plants in the country, when you're finished, you just leave. You don't knock down the building. You don't finish anything there. You don't say, well, because I've gone bust and I finished what I need to do, so I'm going to destroy my facilities and leave it as like exactly how I left it. You just kind of leave the facility. And so actually coming up with, well, what is good enough? What is that end state position you want to be at? And this has varied over time massively from you just need to put a good fence around it and leave it to degenerate and make sure nothing bad happens, to no, it needs to be a completely brownfield site to finish. And actually this has the tendency to change as well, depending on government leadership. There's elections coming up. There might be a change of actual position for how you want to leave this, or what a good looks like for an end state. There are also challenges around degradation, about actually, well, if you leave it in some way, what happens with that future position? What risks do you have if you land it in certain ways? Exactly what we're talking about, because with half-life and stuff that you don't know about. So it's a real challenge, and it's one that the amount of rework that can happen in some of these periods, depending on regulation and governments and what they want to do at a certain time, is a really interesting factor to go into that can put some real inefficiencies in it, as well as kind of with changing pieces.
By extension, there's another side to this that I was discussing last week whilst I was traveling with other governments, was around the notion of, let's not just remember, you're not just taking away the upstream, as in oil and gas, you're familiar with this, James, we talk about upstream, midstream and downstream. And I think that's language I would quite like to introduce into the nuclear debate, where we talk about the repercussions here aren't just removing the production site, so an offshore hydrocarbon extraction, which might be onshore or offshore, but also maybe in oil and gas, you have a refinery like Grangemouth. So if you take out the refinery, then you take out everything upstream of it. There's jobs around this. There's the just transition notions, which I personally think are very important to me. There's an impact on the economy. There's an impact on the environment, but also our policymakers and the stakeholders need to understand, I'm not just taking a power station out. I'm taking a power station offline. That generation is gone and it's not coming back, and it has a consequence for around it. I mean, to me, that's just another one, right? The parallel between the two are very strong.
Now, you've already got me thinking of a challenge that we have, which is government regulation asks us to have a 120-year decommissioning plan for Sellafield, to say how long it's going to take. Sellafield, for those who don't know, it's the largest nuclear facility in Europe, if not maybe even wider than that. And that's where lots of the fuel cycling happens, waste management happens, and those things. And we have to have a plan for, well, when are these buildings going to go offline? When are we going to be getting rid of some of these assets? But we're currently also within a nuclear renaissance where we're building new facilities, new technologies, new things coming through. And so actually, how do you deal with those various requirements, knowing that we've got to be planning for something here? Well, actually, new direction, new things coming from different direction that are going to change that and deal with that. And actually, how do you deal with that uncertainty? Which is a challenge that I am actually having to be dealing with right after this call. I'm going to be looking at some of these problems. And so from whoever from the oil and gas community can be helping us think through some of these problems will be a really great thing to be able to help us understand.
I'm going to move us on, because you and I could probably fill an entire hour just doing this chat and be very spod-like. So I'm going to hand over to you.
I think we have in the past hour as well. So
just be more of the same. Just don't get me started. I'm going to hand over to you for the next one.
No, yeah. So what I wanted to show everyone on the call here, this is one thing that we presented in Glasgow, and just to give everyone a flavour of some of the challenges that we have. If anybody wants an interesting Google, I know I sometimes do, probably even when my children are crying themselves to sleep upstairs, Google Dounreay shaft and silo as an example thing, just to see one of the challenges that we have in the nuclear sector. So for those who don't know Dounreay is a nuclear facility that was an innovation research facility in the north of Scotland. And when I say the north of Scotland, it makes most rigs look quite suddenly. It is north of Thurso, so right near John O'Groats at the furthest tip of the country. It looks something that it isn't often, and a big part of what they have to deal with is what we call the shaft and silo project. So when the site was being developed in the 1950s, the problem of nuclear waste was obviously something that hadn't really been thought through in its entirety yet. And so one of the solutions was to build this 65-meter deep shaft into the ground, kind of just right there, to be able to deposit your waste in. And being in the 1950s, and a little bit like the oil and gas industry in some ways, when kind of putting things away, you don't really think, well, I need to characterize exactly what I'm putting down there, what I'm dealing with, and how I'm looking to this. So all manner of things deposited in this shaft is a very convenient place to deal with waste. There were all sorts of rumours, and Heather's going to say, oh, James, don't mention these things, but rumours of materials to a car, to a bicycle, to someone's ashes being put down there. All sorts of things were mentioned that went down the shaft. And it's been a really huge challenge in that there was actually an explosion. I can't remember the exact years, due to the chemicals in there and what was going on in this thing, that actually there was a pressure built up, and the lid of it actually blew off a few years ago, causing a fairly major safety incident, which was not a great piece to really understand actually, well, we now need to think about how do you keep this safely? So one of the biggest problems isn't just actually decommissioning it, but actually just making sure that you keep that status quo, you keep your materials in a safe place so that nothing even worse happens in the future. And then also one of these challenges of, well, we've got this huge issue, huge problem with massive uncertainty that is a one-off engineering problem. How do we actually deal with this? And how do we make sure that it's decommissioned in a way that is safe, doesn't leave any legacy problems to run about the environment, and doesn't cause any further things? I mean, one of the challenges you'll see here is very, very close to the sea. And therefore, what you don't want is any kind of further issues happening and contamination going out to the wider sea, which is potentially a very real scenario that needs to be looked at and dealt with. So some huge challenges there to be dealing with it. And much like we kind of discovered within the oil and gas world, the funding element of it is a huge problem. Now, with nuclear decommissioning is funded by the Treasury in the country, and there isn't infinite funds for doing these areas. So actually, how do you decommission this in a way that is financially viable but efficient and effective? And what is the value you're going to be getting from this as a country to be able to do this work? And it's a challenge that I've put forward a few times to say, well, potentially the value isn't just you get rid of the liability for the country. The value is the knowledge and the experience and technology you use to doing this, that kind of build up things around the country and actually push it forward. So think of it a different lens. But it's absolutely huge challenges here, something that Duna are kind of pushing onwards, and something that will be going forwards for years to come.
Right. I'm now going to contrast that with an oil and gas one, but to some degree, I'm going to take you and I back into conversation. I think the thing is, we're trying to attract people's attention and say to them, there are scopes here, that there are clear, transparent pieces of work that are good, solid engineering and need really, really good answers. Are we placing too much emphasis on the super geeky, super spotty, super sexy projects and not enough emphasis on the plain vanilla? Like the one I'm about to give right now is just going to look like another large North Sea structure that he's dealing with.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would challenge, yes, but we're inviting people into it. I can give a great example of where we have used some great cross-sector capabilities has been built. So I was speaking to a colleague and they said at Atkins, one of the things they have done is cross-train people in safety cases. So anyone who does an oil and gas safety case can do a nuclear safety case. And exactly that kind of thing, which is not quite the exciting, not quite the sexy piece of work and scope that has some real big things, but there are these huge things that across industries people can look at where it's very easy to be actually using your skill set across these other areas.
Seamlessly, I'm going to press a click button, and then so for those who don't know, a safety case is a health safety executive requirement for a hazardous site where it could be offshore or onshore. And you have a very, very disciplined manual that says this is how the site operates, this is how we close it down if we need to, this is how we start it up if we need to. But for those of you who are familiar working in a high hazardous industry, it's very easy. If you've got no awareness of that, our safety case is just 3,000 pages of document that you've got to somehow read and digest. Okay, so I'll quickly give a counter oil and gas scope. I won't dwell too long. If you if you had been seeing the earlier slides, you might go, cool, that looks rather like the one Sam's already shown twice. Actually, they're all 3 different assets, right? But it's just they were all owned by Shell at different points in time. And so they've got a very similar development path. This is Cormorant Alpha. TAQA, owned by TAQA, a company from UAE who've been owning them for about 14, 15 years. TAQA are removing all of their assets in one go. It's a huge scope of work. There's 52 subsea P&As being done right now. So that's when wells are being shut. Those aren't the wells that you can see reached via this platform, but actually other ones that are dotted in, and I'll show you a subsea development plan in a moment. To get to do some of the ones here, that some of the wells that are on here, they're going to have to replace the actual rig because it went that the drilling derrick won't have been maintained enough. So you've got to take this steel structure down, put in another temporary structure just to get access to the wells. What you're talking about here is a contract for removal of between 4 platforms of 140,000, 14,000 as a topside. So there's a huge amount of work, but again, a mega project that gets a lot of attention by the nature of its scale. The complexity is probably given away by this diagram where you've got Otter, Ida, North Cormorant and Cormorant Alpha. All of these assets in that sequential order, they all produce back to North Cormorant Alpha, and then Alpha exports back out to Sullom Voe for oil. So you and TAQA have had to spend many years working out, and Tones over here as well, many years working out how the hell do you bring them offline. Most members of the public and most non-oil and gas folk don't realize just how much complexity there is below the surface of the sea, let alone the wells. This is your basic plumbing and architecture that runs those 4 assets alone. And the reason I wanted to share it was, A, you get a sense of scale of distance in the bottom left with how far out this all is, but B, you don't just get to cut off the one platform and remove it. You have to think about the engineering consequences and the impact, because at the moment you have to carry on producing oil, all the waste material. Ideally, some of it is going to flow back to Sullom Voe and be dealt with there rather than here. So I'm not going to dwell, but a good example of scopes that we've got in offshore oil and gas.
And a question, maybe not for now, Sam, I have on that, but it's one for oil and gas communities to consider. The thing is, in nuclear, this thing we have called POCO, which is post-operational clean out, which is a huge step of when you finish your operations, how do you clean out your asset to as best as possible, so you're in a good position for remediation and kind of demolition and that side of it. And it's a challenge. It'll be fascinating to show at some stage of actually for some of those subsea ones, how do you get to a place where you're comfortable, that you're cleaned out, that you have got rid of what is very harmful chemicals, very, very dangerous things, away, that you're actually comfortable. And
we're at risk of getting back into the spot. So a really good example here is the pipelines that connect all of these things are typically made of steel. There's an ongoing discussion right now to be had about, are they actually getting mercury embedded in the steel? The reason that might be an issue is that at the moment, on a case-by-case assessment, you're allowed to leave that pipeline in place in the North Sea. If the science starts to show that actually we're getting negative mercury contamination in the pipelines and we have a change of scope, complex. Who's going to go back and do those work on the jobs that have already been done? It's going to be extremely expensive. Is it really worthwhile? I'm going to move us on because we are literally probably going to talk too much. Okay, so for the awareness of attendees and people listening into the recording, our next step is proposed to be 2 separate workshops, but the venues reflect the different communities, and the goal is to try and bring them together. So these are in order of when they're going to happen in schedule, or you could argue they're in alphabetical order. So here you go. First one is up in Aberdeen. Here we will be running a workshop during our main event of the year called DECOM Week 24. That's up. The workshop itself, I think, will be on the 22nd or the 23rd. This has all been done at Ardo House. Now, the goal here is roundtable discussion, primarily because the audience is with an oil and gas community, about what are your blockers? Why aren't you pursuing more work in nuclear? What is it that doesn't work in your favor there? And then if I flip it the other way, Telford, because Aberdeen is A and Telford is W, but also because this is in June, so the NDA, the NIA team and the NDA are running a workshop during the NDA Supplier Day, which is a 2-day. There's actually a 2-day conference. There's a conference the day before and then Supplier Day afterwards, all being held in Telford in June. And guess what? there, we'd probably like to talk to the nuclear community about why the lack of interest, or why are only some of you. And it's not fair to say a lack, because there are parties who are quite happily working in both of these and would concur with us that there is opportunity in both of these. James, before I close and open up the floor for discussion, anything you want to add on either of these two workshops?
No, I think really, to the attendees here, how much you want to be involved and how much you want to be a part of it, we are very open to people being open and collaborative with this. So if this is something that excites you, please let myself, Sam, and Heather know, and we can bring you into the conversations as much as possible, because we see the culture and people's openness being a key part to making this successful. And the more people talk, the more people leading lights in this, the better, really.
Heather, do you want to jump in on that one, or should I just go to the discussion and close that slide?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, Steph and I have both put some links on for the nuclear events coming up in Telford. So again, have a look at those. Be good to see people there. But like I said, it's just a really good opportunity to get people talking about this in person.
Right, my final slide here says discussion and thanks. So I'm going to stop sharing. It was really, I suppose the opportunity now is just a quick chat between us to say, open the floor if there's any questions in chat, or if there's anything there that people want to say. We have no set part for this. It's more a case of we're keen to get the message out there, and we're keen to get more participation in terms of dialogue. What do you think's not working, and why do you think it is? What can we do as a team, as a cross-sector team, to help support that? So I'm open to if anybody wants to raise a hand, feel free, or if anybody who's online wants to just say something, feel free. Oh, she's straight in there, and she's very polite, and she's put her hands up. Come on, Heather.
I do what I'm told, Sam, No, just to reiterate some of the messages that I heard that really resonated with myself, is how by working collaboratively across different industries, it's all about that diversity of thought. And that's really important, because nuclear especially has been seen as quite insular. You start opening it up to different people who've worked in different places and who are working in different places. It helps reduce that group think that you mentioned. And it's just that diversity of thought can be so powerful, not just in technology challenges, but in people challenges and those softer areas you mentioned as well. And the other thing I really liked was your example of logistics, and how from a nuclear point of view, there may be lots we can learn from how the oil and gas community deal with some of these logistics challenges. So I just wanted to reiterate that those were a couple of takeaways that really resonated with me today.
Thank you, Heather. Kenny.
Hello, thank you. Yeah, Kenny Taylor from Zero Waste Scotland. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, James. Really interesting again. I was just thinking about some of the discussion you were having there around the reuse of materials. Obviously, some of those materials will be hazardous or have other chemicals attached to them, etc. But there'll be a huge amount of material coming off both oil and gas and nuclear sites that are, as I think it was Sam says, as vanilla, basically are uncontaminated, ready for reuse. How can you give any reflections on how both industries get over that mindset challenge of people reusing materials from these industries, from these sectors? Or do we go for getting reuse back into the sectors and avoiding that external challenge?
That's like an existential question. I'm not sure I've had enough coffee yet to get to the bottom of it. James, am I going to dump you in it?
You can dump me in it. I can try the best. I mean, the circular waste is something that is a huge kind of thing that's been driven in the country at the moment, and having the infrastructure and actually having the ability to use it, having the confidence in the material is step one. So there is something actually building that, the value chains you call it, around, so that you can get the material, you can use it and bring it back. That gives these organizations confidence. But there's also a piece around when organizations design, when they build, when they do the stuff, asking for this thing and showing that there's appetite to be using it and pushing it, so that, because you don't want to just driving this and pushing it, you also have to pull side of it as well to make sure that's there as well. And knowing there is these appetites, things out there to be doing it.
Kenny, this is an extension and almost warrants its own call, to be totally honest with you. It might be why Heather wants to speak to me later this morning. Heather and I are going to a cross-parliamentary meeting tomorrow in Holyrood. And so there will be NSP, Green, Conservative and Labour MSPs present. And I'm quite interested in that chicken and egg part, which you alluded to just now. And what you're basically saying is, do we work on the market creation and then worry about the contamination and its impact on mindset later, or do we guarantee that people are happy around the mindset and that the creation will come underneath that? I had a very, very detailed conversation with an external consultant, who's the right kind of consultant that we're probably all familiar with, who's working in the space, won't name names. And he's a very strong protagonist for, we need to build the awareness and the appetite before we can really make the market happen. I don't, from a supply chain perspective, we need to remember that decontamination is a huge opportunity. It's an opportunity for jobs, it's an opportunity for activity, and it's about environmental protection underneath it all. So I'm quite happy that there are specialist techniques in the radioactive world where they can deal with this and separate them out and still give you a good grade of steel. And in oil and gas, we've got the same around norms. So I think most of those solutions are there. I think the bigger issue is building the awareness of the need for circularity rather than worrying about contamination. Steve, are you looking to jump in on this one as well, or are you just unmuted by accident? You tell me.
I was going to jump in and then change my mind, but I'll jump in. I think the first thing that needs to happen is there needs to be a change of mindset. We need to stop looking at things as waste. It's not waste until you can't find anything else to do with it. And one of the things that we're seeing in oil and gas, for example, a lot of the tenders include for all materials will go off to a licensed waste disposal facility. So by default, everything's classed as waste and you're trying to bring it back out into recycle. Also, I'm a demolition engineer and I've been in industry a long time, and I've repurposed everything from some boxes in a room to a 108,000 barrel a day refinery. So there's a massive market outside of the offshore oil and gas and nuclear industry around repurposing of equipment. And there are some pitfalls. I remember working with one operator and I asked the same question, and they'd had some issues around the saltum condensers, and someone had taken it off to Amsterdam to refurbish, and it came back full of drugs. So there are some pitfalls. There's a couple of other stories as well, which I don't want to frighten anybody anymore. So that there is there, but we need to start looking at the mindset. And we need to also start to change this attitude of just considering decommissioning when we're designing things, when we put them in. To me, there should be a pathway for anything that goes onto a build, that it has another life. And these composite materials, and everyone talks about wind farm blades, but there's loads of other nano products and stuff out there now that we're putting in, where we're going to have exactly the same issue when they come out. So, there's a big mindset change there. It's not waste till you can't find anything else to do with it. And when we look to design things, where's it going to go when it's finished with its end of life? Because it shouldn't be the end of life. There should be another life for it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Andrew. And actually thinking, we're currently working with a lot of the ANT or SMR, whatever you want to call them, the advanced nuclear technologies or small modular reactors, the next breed of nuclear reactors. And actually these organizations have getting their mindsets to say, well, there's all this things that you can use to build it. So if you designed your work around this, you're going to make it significantly less expensive while being a lot more sustainable. And how do you bring those things into an industry, which obviously is beyond us, but it's meant to be considered.
I'm conscious we've only got 3 minutes left. David Oxbury's just asked quite a long question, but I'm not sure if I'm going to get to the bottom of that in 3 minutes. Yeah, I think he's probably concurring with us that there are specialist solutions that are already out there. Kenny, you asked the question. I'm going to guess you're either happy with that or...
Yeah, that was great. A great response, essentially. Covered all the bases. You're right, Sam, there are opportunities out there. There are organisations currently doing this. We could expand on that and create a much bigger supply chain. But there is a mindset and there are bureaucratic elements to this, as alluded to in terms of procurement, referring to licensed facilities, which tend to suggest a certain route that could be tweaked to change the way we manage these. So yeah, a good comprehensive answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. Right, it is literally 2 minutes to go, so I don't think I'm going to squeeze anything in. Anybody, anything else before I say a genuine thanks to all for attending, for presenting?
I'm going to
and
ask
sharing?
you one annoying question, Sam.
Go for it.
No, for me. Comes to how are we actually going to put some of these things in place?
Well, I think that's a topic for Aberdeen and Telford, right? I think market economics will ultimately provide the solutions, but we need to encourage people to be willing to dive down that route. And I think that goes back to, Kenny's job at Zero Waste Scotland. Is it policy that's going to derive these outcomes, or is it policy that enables outcomes through other factors? I don't like the idea of market intervention, but you could argue there's some seriously big challenges in here. What I do think is that at the end of the day, the supply chain will, when there is a need, we normally see a solution eventually, and that's what needs supporting, is the connection between the need and finding the solution. Am I just rambling on there, James, or is that okay?
No, that's perfect. I always like a nice action at the end.
Turn up in Aberdeen, turn up in Telford, and we'll try and take these ideas off you. If it's on a sticky, if it's on a business card, or if it's in an email, or it's just a chat. That's the goal of our next stages, which is these 2 workshops. We'll share all that details. These materials will be shared. Thank you all very much for attending, and I'm determined to close on time. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.